All right, Archie, I love you too, but I need to do my video. Is that okay? Welcome back to my Next Generation Firewall Engineer series, where I teach you all of the skills required to take the Palo Alto Networks Certified Next Generation Firewall Engineer certification. This is one of the specialist certifications in Palo Alto Networks' new role-based certification program. And specifically, it's a certification that specializes in knowing if you can configure the basics of a next generation firewall. And I will be going through each of the sections one by one. I've already completed the first section, which was on interfaces. And today we're going to be talking about zones. This lesson will cover section 1.2 of the blueprint for the Palo Alto Networks Certified Next Generation Firewall Engineer, and that section just says configure zones. Zones, I think, sometimes seem like a very simple concept. I know when I took Security Plus several years ago, they said that zone was just a kind of a synonym for enclave. But I think honestly, zone is a little bit more complicated than that, but also more fundamental to what is special about a Palo Alto Networks next generation firewall. I would say it's probably the most fundamental thing other than App ID. I think App ID and zones are kind of the two core ideas that have to make you rethink how you do network security when you're using a next generation firewall, especially from Palo Alto Networks. And I guess to kind of highlight this, I want to talk a little bit about a debate I got into with somebody on Reddit. No surprise for those of you who've been following me for a while, you know that I like to go on Reddit and see questions that people ask specific to Palo Alto Networks, because I find a lot of really interesting use cases that people put out there. And I like to answer those, and I like to use them to toy around in my lab because people come up with all kinds of unique things. But I also, sometimes get into disagreements, and I do learn a lot from those as well. But someone asked a question. They were kind of struggling to understand the trust and untrust zones, and I was saying that I actually don't like that terminology because I think that's a very kind of boundary like mindset, and the point of having zones in Palo Alto Networks next generation firewalls altogether is that you don't have this just like internal and external boundary. You're not just building a wall around your castle. You're actually trying to divide up all your assets into into zones, but into different sections, and you're trying to figure out, okay, from which section to which other section do you want to apply network security controls. And so, for example, if you have all of your workstations, you can put all your workstations in one zone, and then all of their servers that host the types of applications that they might be accessing in a different zone. And then when those workstations are accessing those servers, when users are logging into that workstation, they're accessing the applications on those servers. You can now apply network security controls to control the internal access as well. Of course, those workstations will also be accessing the internet, so there will be kind of that boundary type protection as well. But it's kind of, you have to kind of think in those terms when you're thinking of zones. Is okay, well, how can you break them up? And that's why I personally, and I said this in the Reddit post, I got a lot of thumbs down on this. So I guess thanks Reddit love the downvotes on Reddit. But I don't like the trust untrust zone names personally. I prefer just to call them what they are, even if you just have an internal network and you're just connecting to the internet. I prefer call it internal and internet. It makes more sense to me. But I've seen a lot of kind of more robust configurations where you have a wireless zone, and you have a workstation zone, and you have a databases zone and a server zone. Of course, a DMZ might be there as well for public-facing applications. Those are kind of the more robust solutions I've seen, and that's really kind of gets you to rethink how you use a firewall, and it allows you to use the next generation firewall in the way that's most secure. But you have to kind of architect your network to be that way. So you can't just architect your network just to have a boundary. So that's really the purpose of zones, and it's just something to think about. But as I mentioned, the exam blueprint wants you to configure zones. So understanding the theory is helpful, but this is not a theoretical exam like the cybersecurity practitioner or the network security generalist. This is a This is a specialist exam that requires you to know how to configure it. So let's jump into configuring the zone, and I'm going to open up my firewall here, and you can see that if you want to configure a zone, you need to go to Network, and then Interface is what we configured last time, but now we're going to configure a zone. You can see some of the zones that I have here, but let me just create a new zone so you can see what types of fields there are when creating a zone. And really all you need to create a new zone is just the name, so you could just call this like new zone. And then you would want to add a log setting. Log settings are going to be it's going to be the same log setting that you would use for a security policy for a log forwarding profile. So you see here I have some set up, and yeah, I have a couple set up that I created. But unfortunately, log settings, that's really going to be much more of a NetSec analyst type topic. So if you're studying for the NetSec analyst, if you want me to do a class on NetSec analyst, let me know. Put that in the comments. I can do that maybe after my Next Generation Firewall engineer class. But I'm not going to show you how to configure it. But you do want to know about log setting. Just make sure you remember this as you're studying for your certification. Log setting is specific to zone protection profiles. And I'm going to cover zone protection profiles pretty in depth in this video, so stand by for that. But that's the main thing I want you to know about log setting, is that log settings are specific to zone protection profiles. So if there's anything that you're trying to log in your zone protection profile, and you want those logs to be, especially if you want them to be forwarded, then you're going to need to configure a log forwarding profile and that you're going to have here in your log setting. The next thing that's important to know about a zone is the type. So you actually need to match the type to the type of interface that you want. So in the previous video I made, I covered the different types of interfaces. So if you're not familiar with that, go back and watch that video. But there's the default is the tap interface. Funnily enough, that's actually not listed in the types of interfaces that you need to know in the exam blueprint. But I did cover virtual wire, layer 2, layer 3, and tunnel. One thing that's interesting is actually if you do a layer 3 interface, a zone, you can actually tie that to a tunnel interface. So that's also something that's probably worth knowing. But in general, you're going to want your zone to match the type of the interface. So if you're going to have a tunnel interface, you probably want to have a tunnel zone that you're going to tie to that. All right, so that's the type. Then you can add the interfaces. One thing that's very, very important to know, this is just kind of, hopefully this helps you wrap your mind around what a zone is too, is that you can have multiple interfaces in the same zone, but you have multiple interfaces in the same zone, but each interface can only have one zone. So for example, say you have two ISPs, right? You have two internet service providers. For redundancy, use both Verizon and AT&T, right? Your 1/1 interface and your 1/2 interface can both be in the internet zone, right? Because you have redundancy and you have two interfaces that are both connected to the internet. So you have them both in the internet zone. And so when you create security policies, you kind of want to consider the internet as a zone. You can add them both here. So you can add both 1/1 and 1/2. However, you can't then create another zone called Verizon and then make 1/1 a member of both your internet zone and this Verizon zone. You get to pick one. So it's only going to be one zone. So you kind of have to determine how you want to configure that. But you can't add two zones to a single interface. So hopefully that kind of gets you to understand the idea of a zone. That's just a very important thing to remember when trying to understand zones, is that zones, multiple interfaces can have the same zone, but can be in multiple interfaces can be in the same zone, but each interface can only have one zone. So you can't have multiple zones in one interface. Multiple interfaces to one zone, yes. Multiple zones to one interface, no. All right, zone protection, as I mentioned, I'm going to cover that a little bit later. So let me just skip over this briefly and we'll come back to it because I'm going to go in depth into zone protection. Let me zoom out so I can show you this pre-NAT identification here. I know this is a little bit small, but pre-NAT identification, I'm not going to go too in depth into this because this is much more a Prisma Access type thing. Pre-NAT identification is specific to Prisma Access. So if you're using Prisma Access and you have a service connection set up between Prisma Access and your Next Generation Firewall, then you can do pre-NAT identification with things like user ID. And I'll explain user ID a little bit more in a second, but basically user ID will map users to IP addresses. So if you want, if you have a user mapped to an IP address on Prisma Access, but then you have those IP addresses translated via network address translation before they arrive to your firewall, so your firewall can't see those IP addresses, then you're going to need to have that information forwarded from Prisma Access to your firewall for an established security processing node, an SPN. That's all very Prisma Access terminology, so don't worry too much about that. All you need to know about pre-NAT identification is that it is a way of getting information about these things, user ID, device ID, from Prisma Access if you have a service connection set up. And if you want to do that, then you need to select the associated option here. So like if you want to do that with user ID, for example, you need to select that. That's all you really need to know about pre-NAT identification, because it's much more of a Prisma Access topic. I'm not going to go any deeper into that. Don't worry too much about understanding it deeper than that. What you do need to understand is that you need user identification and device identification to be enabled on the zone that you are using that with, and specifically the ingress zone. So if you have, so let me give you an example for user identification. So user identification will map an IP to a user. So let's say, for example, you have a workstations zone, and there are several workstations within, let's say, the same subnet, and they're connecting to a workstation zone. So say we wanted to make this the workstation zone. This workstations zone, it's going to be, let's say it's a layer 3 zone. All right, then now we need to now we need to, if we want to determine what users are accessing those workstations, then we need to check here, enable user identification. And the way that would work, if you're not familiar with user identification, is say that users can log into the different workstations, but you want to control access from specific users. So you want to make sure that only certain users can SSH into your databases, and you have a different zone for databases. So when they are accessing those databases, their traffic's going to go through the firewall, and when remember, this is going to be on the ingress zone, so you wouldn't configure this on the databases zone, you'd configure this on the ingress zone, so the one that they're accessing from, so they're from the workstations, and you're trying to identify which user is accessing. So when the user logs into that workstation, say they're using Active Directory, it's going to log in with Active Directory, and with user ID, and this is outside the scope of this particular this particular lesson right now. But with user ID, we will cover user ID late in another lesson, 2.6. But with user ID, you can basically determine which user logged into that workstation. So because basically what happens is it logs in with Active Directory. Active Directory sees what IP is logging in with that user, and then it forwards that information to the firewall. So the firewall has that connection, so that it knows. It's able to see, okay, which IP is associated with, or which user is associated with this IP, and then it can determine that it's that user. Then you can build policies based on the user. So you can say, hey, only these users are allowed to SSH into the database. Right now, you can do that at the network level. So if that's something that you want to do, and again, I'm going to cover this I'm going to cover user ID in a later lesson. So if you didn't understand user ID, don't worry too much yet. But if that's something you want to do, if you want to determine what user is this coming from, you're going to have to check enable user identification on the ingress zone, so on the place where the user is coming from. Device ID, very similar. Instead of determining what user, you want to determine what device. So device ID, basically it takes advantage of network traffic and DHCP logs to determine what type of device that is, the manufacturer, model, etc. and it can determine what the device is. So if you want to build policies saying that, hey, this device, this printers, I want to build a policy for printers, and I want to say, these types of printers from this manufacturer can only access these particular endpoints. If you want to build that type of policy with a source device, then you're going to need to enable device identification on the zone where that device is coming from. So if you have a printer zone, for example, or if your printers are just in your internal zone, then you're going to want to enable this on your internal zone. You can also add include lists or exclude lists for both of these. So for example, if you have an internal zone, so say instead of a workstation zone, you have an internal zone, but you only want user identification on your workstations. So let's just say your workstations are like 192.168.5.0/24. Say that's where your workstations are coming from. That's their subnet. But if you have a bigger internal zone that has other devices where you don't want to do user ID, then you can do an include list. Similarly, you can do an exclude list. So if you want user identification on everything, but there's a specific subnet where it's like, hey, that's where all my IoT devices are, my printers and refrigerators and etc., and there's no user ID on those, then you can add those to the exclude list. So you can do this either would be an allow or block list type function. The reason that you want to do that, and the reason that you don't want to enable user ID on the zone unless you need it, and that you want to make sure you do these include and exclude lists to kind of be narrow with how you do user ID, is that user ID takes up additional processing. So in order not to overload your firewall, you don't want to overuse user ID. Just make sure you're only using it on the subnets and zones where it actually would be used, where there's actually workstations that people are logging into and you're actually identifying individual users. If it's just a server with a service account out there and there's not actually individual users logging in, then you may not want to enable user identification, depending on how you have those things configured. All right, so I've now covered everything in the zone except for zone protection. So let me go deep into zone protection. First, you can see here that we have enable packet buffer protection and enable layer 3 and layer 4 header inspection. One thing to know about this is these are things that you have to configure per zone. And I'll first explain packet buffer protection. So packet buffer protection, in order for your firewall to be able to process all these packets as they come in, it has to build up a packet buffer. So it's a basically a queue. It's a buffer. It's building up where it's taking in the packets, and if they as it processes one, it's kind of a first in first out way of processing them and in the buffer. And so as it comes through, it's going to process it. It's going to do the security processing and come out. But as that buffer gets larger and larger, it can cause the firewall to be overwhelmed, and that can create a denial of service. And so there's ways to protect against that, and I'll get to those in a second. But if you want to protect from that packet buffer from being targeted and being intentionally overwhelmed, then you can enable packet buffer protection. For layer 3 and layer 4 header inspection, I'll give some examples of what those headers can be in a second. But if you want to inspect headers specific to that for your zone protection, you need to check this as well. What's important to know about this is if you want to do either of these, you're going to have to configure those globally in your firewall as well. So you can't just configure them per zone. You do have to configure them in the zone. So if you want to do those, again, it has to be the ingress zone. So generally, this isn't always true, but generally for packet buffer protection, that's going to be your internet zone that you're going to be most concerned with. But not always true, but generally that's the case. So you're going to have to do them per zone. Additionally, you're going to have to configure them globally in the firewall. And you do that under device, setup, and then session. And you see here we've got layer 3 and layer 4 header inspection. And when this loads in a second, you're going to see that that is not checked. So even if I had checked it in the zone, it wouldn't have worked because it's not configured globally. This is the type of question you're going to see a lot on Palo Alto Networks type certifications. And I don't know, this is not, please please don't accuse me of sharing questions, because I have no clue if this is on the exam or not. A type of question I've often seen on various Palo Alto Network certifications is, if A, B, and C is working, what could be the issue, right? So it could say, hey, this layer 3, and I'll show you kind of how the policies are set up. This layer 3 policy is set up, and it's checked in the zone. What could be the issue? The issue could be that it's not configured globally, right? So that is the type of question. So you need to know that if you want to use layer 3 and layer 4 header inspection at all on any zone, you have to check it here. So you have to go here, and you have to check it right here. Additionally, and let me zoom out so you can see this. I don't know if there's no, I wish there was a way to, no, it's not going to make my life easy. All right, additionally, I apologize for this being so small, but you can see here that you have to also check packet buffer protection. This is checked by default, but this is where you're going to see your alert and activate. It's very important that you understand the alert specifically and activate. Alert, again, you're going to have to configure those log forwarding if you want to log. But at what point, so when your packet buffer gets to how full do you want it to alert? And then activate is now going to be when does it start doing random early drops. You can you can also configure based on latency. So once there's a certain amount of latency in milliseconds, then you can also alert or activate. And then you can also create a block countdown. So what that means is once it hits 80%, it creates it starts a countdown at this, which is this hold time. So in this case, it's going to say, okay, my packet is now 80% full. I'm going to start my 60-second timer, and if it doesn't get out of 80%, out of the 60%, I'm going to just block. I'm just going to block the session that's overloading my buffer, and it's going to block for this long. So that is 60 times 60 seconds times 60 minutes, which is it's an hour. That's what I'm trying to say. It's an hour. 60 times 60 seconds is an hour. So it's going to start doing random early drop of the sessions at 80%, and then it's also, in this case, it's also going to begin its countdown threshold of 60 seconds, also at 80%. And if it doesn't get below 80%, that's when it's going to start blocking. It's going to block for a whole hour. Important to know. And you can do the same thing based on latency. So rather than how full is it, just like is the latency over like 50 milliseconds, etc. That is a global setting. It's configured here. This is not configured in the profile. You just configure this here. And then if you want to apply it to a zone, you have to then go check it in the zone. Let's go back to buffer protection. So those would be configured here, or zone protection. I apologize. We were just on buffer protection. So you're going to go to network profiles, zone protection. I don't know if you can see this. It's under here. Can I? Oh, here we go. I can zoom in like this. There we go. All right, so you can see it here. Zone protection. It's under network profiles, zone protection. And these are the different fields. So again, let's just walk through some of the zone protection options here. I'm not going to go super deep into all of these. There's a couple that I want to make sure you know. But basically, if you want to stop specific types of flooding, so very common SYN flooding, right? So if you're getting a bunch of SYNs, if you're getting over, what is this case, 10,000, more than 10,000 SYN connections per second, you can start doing random early drop, or you can create SYN cookies. I'm not going to go super deep into that. If you don't know what those things are, then that's more of a kind of a network security type class. I know SANS GCIA covers things like that, so you can look into those. Or if you want me to make a video on that, let me know in the comments. I'm happy to. I do have GCIA, and I'm also a network analyst in the military. So I've done forensics on these types of things before. But yeah, that's just an example of the types of flood protection. So you can just see these different types of floods. So basically, if there's for some reason you're getting tons and tons of connections per second, flooding a specific zone, then you can do different actions. All right. There's also reconnaissance, so you can also stop port scans, right? So if someone's scanning a bunch of ports, trying to scan like a bunch of TCP ports, you can alert or block, or you can actually block the IP, which will block the specific IP that's doing that port scan for a certain period of time. Additionally, someone's doing a host sweep, so if they're trying to like ping sweep across different hosts, same thing. One thing that's cool about this is you can do source address exclusion. So if you want to apply, so if you want to say, hey, I want to block port scans and host sweeps, etc. But actually, I have this one device. I have my my Nessus scanner, and it does that, and that's part of its job is to do these sweeps. Then you can kind of allow less, so you can exclude the address of your Nessus scanner, for example. I think you might not be able to see this. So here, let me just do this so I can make sure you can see that source address exclusion, right? So you can do IPv4, just put your Nessus scanner there, for example, and then it won't follow these policies. Some passive, so yeah, if you want to top like spoofed IP addresses, and you can drop them. I should probably do more. I'm going to do more of this actually after this lesson. I'm going to configure more of this on my firewall. I'm not going to go into all of these specific details. I do think that this section wants you to understand zones. I think you just want to generally understand zone protection. That you can do some packet-based attack protection, like stopping spoofed IP addresses. You can, like if there's specific types of IPv6 routing headers that aren't normal, you can block those as well. You can also do, if you have some kind of concerns about specific Ethernet types, obviously there's the standard Ethernet types that indicate IPv4 and IPv6. Then you can block those, or you can make sure there's only so implicit deny for all unlisted protocols. So you can make sure that you're only allowing Ethernet that you want to. So this is pretty kind of like in-depth layer 2 stuff that you can do here, that you can say like, hey, I only want this specific ether type. If you want to do that, you can definitely lock that down pretty far. So there's some advanced stuff you can do. And layer 3, this is for or layer Ethernet security group tags. I'm not going to cover this. What I did want to cover was the layer 3 and layer 4 header inspection. And that is because that is the thing that I showed you that you can enable, again, globally or on the zone itself. And so let me just show you some of the headers that you can build. I do have a video on custom signatures in your firewall, and and this is going to be very similar to that. It's not the same, because a lot of those signatures have to do with like application type headers, like HTTP headers, DNS headers, things like that. So those are application protocols. This is a little bit different because this is layer 3 and layer 4. So this isn't going to be kind of those application layers. These are going to be your internet and transport layers. And let me just show you some examples here. So context, right? Your IP version, your IP header length, right? These are all your layer 3 headers. So if there's specific headers, this is like kind of that more in-depth like custom signature thing. So if you have specific headers you're looking for because you have specific signatures associated with that, you have specific concerns, or there's specific things that you want to allow based on that, then you can you can do that here. And then same thing with your layer 4 inspection. So source port, destination port. If there's kind of specific things you want to build based on the layer 3, layer 4 inspection, then you can do that here as well. So this is pretty in depth. This, I wouldn't worry about this being covered in the at that level. This is just something I think that just know that these layer 3 and layer 4 headers, these are the types of things that you can build, and you can use this to build a signature using kind of your Boolean and or logic to build a big signature for layer 3 and layer 4 headers into some kind of an attack signature, or maybe something that you're actually looking for just depending on your environment. So pretty kind of custom stuff. Generally, it's going to be kind of an attack signature. Hey, I know this is associated with this CVE or this bug track. For example, just as an example. So, all right. So that is zone protection profiles. So in summary, it's very important to understand zones. It's important to understand that your log setting in your zone is going to be tied to your zone protection profile, and it's going to follow that log forwarding profile, and it's whatever you configure in your zone protection is going to forward based on that log forwarding profile. You want to make sure your type and your interface match. So the type of interface of your zone and the type of your zone and the type of your interface are the same. In layer 3, zone can be on a tunnel interface. However, in general, you want to match those as much as possible. And so, and that kind of aligns with making sure that you have an understanding of how your interfaces are going to align to your zones. And remember, you can have multiple interfaces in one zone, but you can't have multiple zones tied to one interface. A common example of that might be multiple internet zones, for example. So that's another thing that's important to remember. Remember that if you have a Prisma access setup and you want to and you have sort of a pre-NAT, if you have a pre-NAT configuration, if you have pre-NAT things, so you have IPs in Prisma Access that before network address translation, you need to know what user they are, then you might need to do pre-NAT identification for that zone as well, and that will be something that you will configure with Prisma Access, but the very specific details how to configure that are beyond the scope of this certification. Also, you want to know that the user identification, if you want to do user identification on the zone, you need to enable that on the ingress zone. And if you want to do device identification on that zone, you also need to enable that on the ingress zone. I will cover user identification much more in depth later in this series, but that's something that's important to know about zones. Finally, it's important to know about zone protection. So there are two options that you can enable with zone protection. One is going to be your packet buffer protection. If you want to use that, then you need to enable it in the zone, but you also need to make sure it's enabled globally under device setup session, and the settings are also going to be there globally. So those are going to be your global sessions, but you need to enable it per zone as well. And that's going to be your kind of understanding your packet buffer, so that buffer that's kind of holds all the queue that holds all the packets as they process for first in, first out. And as that buffer gets bigger, that can cause a denial of service on your firewall. And you're going to want to make sure that you have some protections in place to keep your firewall from getting its buffer overloaded, and which would kind of cause your firewall to get taken down, which could cause your network taken down. So that's the value of doing that packet buffer protection. Additionally, if you want to do layer 3 and layer 4 header inspection, which I did walk through, so that's going to be those layer 3 and layer 4 header things like the length and the specific IP protocol, etc. Or to TCP port number, those would be your layer 3 and layer 4 headers, right? Then you're going to need to check that box if you're doing something at that level. That is kind of building custom signatures, so that's pretty advanced. And I haven't, honestly, to be honest, I haven't seen that in a lot of environments. But just so you know what that is for, and again, that's something you need to enable globally, and you also need to enable it per zone if you are using it in the zone protection profile. Finally, just understand that zone protection profile is there for various things like flooding. Flooding is honestly the most common that I've seen, flood protection. But there's a few other things that you can do in there as well, which I covered. So that's what a zone protection profile is, and it helps protect that zone from various attacks such as flooding. If you found this video useful, if you feel like I covered zones well, or zone protection profile, let me know. If you think that I missed some things, please let me know. I got some good feedback on the last video. I'm very open to feedback. This was a bit of a longer lesson, but I want to make sure I covered both the zones, the zone protection profiles, as well as the global settings. In the next video, we're going to cover high availability. I think I'm going to break up that video a little bit, so I'm going to do both. I won't just do active-active and active-passive in the same video, so that it's not too long of a video. But I hope you enjoyed this lesson, and I'll see you next time.